Well, maybe we'll begin because people can certainly join in as they can. Um, Welcome everyone to our webinar that's focusing on well, it's a series that the Jesuit Forum and our partners, which I'll name in a moment, called Political Action Rooted in Discernment. And our webinar for this evening is focused on the Citizens for Public Justice Poverty Trends 2024 report, and focusing in particular on the question of affordability. As we know, so much of our focus, our political focus and our social focus is on questions of affordability, the inflationary costs, our groceries, as well as cost of living and sense of housing costs. So everything from micro to macro, it's a very big concern, especially coming out of COVID. But it's not only a result of COVID, but it certainly aggravated the issue of affordability. So welcome everyone, and we're pleased that you're with us. And maybe before us, well, as we begin, let us acknowledge the land upon which we join one another, our various places within Canada. I assume everyone's within Canada, that we call home, and of our First Nations people and Inuit and Métis who also call this land home. So we acknowledge that the land upon which the Jesuit Forum meets with all of you today, and I invite you to include in the chat where you come from, the traditional territory upon which you live and are blessed to call home. But the land upon which the Jesuit Forum joins you, commonly known as Toronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe peoples, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat peoples. And we also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 3 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so we are grateful to have this opportunity to call this sacred land home, our common home, in relationship with the Indigenous peoples, both the traditional peoples and those, their ancestors, who are with us today. And I invite you again to include in the chat where you join us from. I'll just take a moment to let people offer that. So we are grateful for all the peoples and organizations who have helped organize this series with us on the question of affordability, as seen through the Citizens for Public Justice Poverty Trends 2024 report, and in particular, Citizens for Public Justice, which Natalie will be joining us from, and I'll introduce her in a moment, or one of our main speakers. Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Toronto, the Ministry for Social Justice, Peace and Creation Care, an office of the Sisters of St. Joseph, Toronto, the Mary Ward Center, Social Justice Office of the Loretto Sisters, IBVM Sisters of Canada, Catholic Conscience of the Toronto Diocese, the Centre Oblat out of Ottawa, and ORCE, the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, also based out of Ottawa. I think it's Ottawa. So I hope I'm not missing anyone, but we're really glad for our partners in organizing this series of events. Um, these needed conversations, political conversations, and with a contemplative disposition. And we thank Natalie Appleyard for joining us, along with Stephen Hurley, and they are going to lead us into a conversation on the pressing issues of affordability, as Natalie, as one of the co-authors of the Citizens for Public Justice Poverty Trends 2024 report. And some of the insights that she has come up with in her and her colleagues' research, kind of the state of affordability in Canada, and how we can look forward, how we can move forward. Not necessarily answers, but with prayerful insights. And so, and this is going to be in the form of a conversation between Natalie and Stephen. And so, and just a word that this is being recorded, and it will be turned into, converted into a podcast, so people can listen in later on. So you'll get a link to that later on. But I just hand it now over to Natalie and Stephen, and you can feel free, please introduce yourselves a little bit further as you feel fit. So, Stephen and Natalie, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Father Trevor. Natalie, welcome. Natalie Appleyard, you are the socioeconomic policy analyst for Citizens for Public Justice. And I know there's a lot more to say, but I'm curious to find out what draws you to this work. Maybe you could introduce yourself through that lens of passion.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm grateful for this time together. I first started at Citizens for Public Justice about 8 years ago, thanks to someone in this meeting, actually. Joe Gunn gave me my first kick at the can in terms of the world of policy and social justice. So I'm always grateful to Joe for giving me that first chance. I have a background in education, and my master's of education looked at bringing social justice issues into the classroom. And really the passion for me came through my reading of scriptures and my I guess my conviction, but also what most drew me to seek God and to seek wisdom from the scriptures was this idea of God's unconditional love for all people. I was really struck throughout reading the prophets of how God calls people to work for justice, to stand with the oppressed, and that was such a pervasive theme for me, and it was really this beautiful vision of how humanity and creation could be together in harmony. And so that's always been the starting point for me. And I was really drawn to CPJ because of their work on these issues from a systemic level, and looking at sort of the big picture, looking at how all these different issues are connected, and looking at how individual citizens, institutions, and governments all have a role to play in making a better, more just world.
Well, it's great to be here with you. By way of introduction, I'm Stephen Hurley, and I spent 30 years as an elementary school teacher in Dufferin Peel District School Board in Mississauga, Brampton, here in Ontario. Since then, been doing some consulting work and started a education podcast radio network, as one does when they retire, about 9 years ago. And I've turned that over to an organization now, and I am a full-time theology student at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto, just down the road from Trevor and Regis College. And so that's where I travel every day, and it's through walking up Bay Street every day that I've become more aware of some of the issues that you spend your day working on, and probably some sleepless nights as well. So good to have this conversation with you. I wanted to highlight the subtitle of your report, the Policy Trends 2024, Finding Our Place in Systemic Change. And hopefully in this conversation, before we send people off into their discussion groups, we'll be able to help people position themselves with some of the issues that we're going to be talking about. I wanted to begin with this sense of affordability, and it's a term that we hear a lot. We hear affordability framed in terms of issues. More recently, and maybe more urgently, we hear about an affordability crisis. I wondered if we could spend a bit of time just unpacking what we mean by affordability and possibly some of the assumptions that we might bring to our thinking. Some of those assumptions may need to be challenged. But how do you help people unpack that term affordability?
Well, I think it's always helpful to distinguish between something being expensive versus something being unaffordable. And there's a lot of talk today about the increased prices of groceries, of transportation, of housing in particular. And for some people, this might be the first time that they're kind of feeling that pinch, and that they're really noticing, gosh, this is taking up a lot more of my income. There are other people who, for their whole lives, perhaps have struggled with affordability, and that issue is being exacerbated now with these skyrocketing prices. And so when we talk about affordability and the affordability crisis, and when in our poverty trends report we're talking about poverty, really what we're concerned about are people who cannot afford the goods and services that they need for their right to an adequate standard of living. So not being able to pay for the housing, the medication, the food, the clothing, the childcare that you need because you lack income. That's an affordability crisis. And when more and more people are experiencing these problems, when we're seeing these deeply persistent trends in terms of who is most disproportionately impacted by the affordability crisis, by poverty, that's what we're concerned about, is sort of the inequity of the systems that are creating these conditions. So again, we are distinguishing between expensive but still within your financial means versus I don't have money for the things that I need to live in dignity and to participate in society.
At what point, Natalie, does it become a crisis, or has it become a crisis? Because affordability issues have been around, well, since the Hebrew Bible was written.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Stephen, because I think, as much as we talk about this crisis, you could look at generations before of people who have been experiencing this kind of unaffordability, this kind of poverty, and it was a crisis then too. Sometimes you hear the word crisis when people in the middle class and upper classes start to be affected by these things that have been affecting others for generations. But certainly we have seen a big spike in poverty rates. So whereas from 2015 to 2020, we saw decreasing rates in terms of poverty in Canada. We saw decreasing rates for child poverty specifically. Since 2020, we've seen a sharp uptick again in those rates. And we've also seen just an acceleration of the costs of living, particularly when you look at housing, when you look at grocery prices. And while, yes, some of that is due to inflation, some of that can be attributed to some of the supply chain issues that we were experiencing during the pandemic. There are other factors at play in terms of a lack of regulatory controls, in terms of the increased privatization and profitization of a lot of these goods and services. So there are some newer contemporary factors that it's not that they didn't exist before, but we're seeing like a greater concentration of these issues. We're seeing them being a bit more widespread, and so it's going well beyond just, you know, your typical inflationary increases from year to year.
Now, CPJ has come out with a number of these reports over the years. Do you feel that there's a greater sense of urgency with this particular report, especially given what's happening politically around the world and our upcoming election here in Canada? Do you feel a greater sense of urgency?
Well, I would say again that, you know, these problems are not new, and so these alarm bells have been ringing for decades and for generations. So in some sense, you know, it's not a new crisis, but it's almost an acceleration of these problems, and it's an exacerbation of these problems. So there is certainly a sense of urgency. I would say, given that this context of polarization, given the context of greater political instability, that certainly does create a sense of urgency. But I think for me, you know, the greatest sense of urgency is just understanding what people are living with every day, or what people are dying from every day, and understanding that this is impacting more and more people, and seeing processes and policies in place that are making it worse instead of making it better when we have better options available to us. So I think the sense of urgency is, you know, just this idea that we're yelling like, stop, like we don't have to go this way. We don't have to continue down this road and make it even worse for people. We know that there are alternative solutions. We have evidence that there are other programs and policies that would be more effective, more equitable. So we've been sounding these alarms for a while. And again, sometimes when people who weren't impacted by these issues before start to feel that squeeze, then you try to kind of capitalize on that moment and engage more and more people in working together to bring about that change that's so needed and has been needed for generations.
And we are going to get to that systemic level that is so important and so vibrant in your report. I wanted to return to a little bit of maybe the story that you brought up at the beginning, and that is your faith journey and how that impacted the work that you're doing with CPJ, and the fact that Citizens for Public Justice is a faith-oriented organization in the sense that it does have and it comes alongside of a vision that I'm thinking goes back to those Hebrew covenant days, and that dream of shalom that God has for God's creation. How does that affect the way that you personally and the organization approaches these issues? Because it's not every day that you find organizations bringing those two things into line with each other. I mean, it may be every day for you, but certainly out in the public square, that's not always the case.
Right. That's not always the narrative we hear about Christian engagement in politics, is it?
No,
But fundamentally, for us at CPJ, our work on poverty and affordability is grounded in our conviction that all people are created in the image of God with that inherent dignity and worth. And we also believe that we're called to love our neighbor, to seek justice for the oppressed, and to live in respect with creation. So I often share with folks when I'm speaking to churches and congregations and other faith-based groups that this idea of the Imago Dei has sort of a secular parallel in the human rights framework. So when we look at this idea that people have inherent rights and dignity, I find that very consistent with this theology of the Imago Dei. And when we look at the evidence in terms of who is experiencing poverty, and we see these huge disparities, we see these huge inequities, it becomes very clear that this is not just a matter of people falling on hard times and needing a hand. These are systemic barriers that people are facing. If it weren't systemic, then we would expect to see pretty similar poverty rates across communities, across groups of people in Canada. And that's just not the case. So when we see that there are these systemic inequities, and we are committed to this idea that each and every person deserves that right to an adequate standard of living, that shifts the way that we're called to respond to poverty, because we're seeing those people as rights holders. We're seeing those people as having that inherent dignity and worth. And we understand that we as a society have a responsibility to one another, and to creation. And so I feel that that creates a greater level of ambition than we typically see from our policy responses. So if you believe that a person who's experiencing poverty is a rights holder, that they have a right to an adequate standard of living, and that government has a responsibility to create those conditions for them to access that right to an adequate standard of living, then the outcome that you should be going for is that they're not in poverty anymore. Not that they're just in like 25% less poverty. And you should be, your goal should be to eradicate poverty and to eradicate those inequities and those disproportionate rates of poverty that we see. And so I think our faith compels us to have a greater vision. I think it gives us some training in that kind of radical imagination. We have practice in living into hope, and not just hoping that things will get better, but really being committed to live in a different way and to show what is possible when we relate to one another in a different way. And so I think that that spiritual formation that we have, that hope and that vision that we have, really elevates our ambition and changes the way that we relate to people in poverty, so that it's one of solidarity as opposed to one of charity or suspicion.
And we have a pretty good example in Jesus. I mean, this is not a new idea, is it? It's and you talked about some of the frustration at ringing the bells for years and years and years, and there's even scriptural precedents and support for that. The voice crying in the wilderness, which I'm sure you feel like at some point. But you have this report, you have this Poverty Trends 2024 report, and in it there's a lot there. There's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of statistics. There's a lot of support for, I guess, changing the narrative, as you say. I wondered if we could talk about some of the drivers of affordability and maybe unpack that. And I know that we can isolate them, but they also intersect with each other in many people's lives. What are some of the main drivers of affordability and the crisis?
So we, in the report, folks can see that we talk about some of the historic factors and some of the more contemporary factors. And I think it is important for us to look back and understand the systems and the norms, the attitudes that have shaped the way our policies are designed today. Even though we've come a long way in terms of greater equality in the law, I'm sure glad that I'm not a woman born 100 years ago. My life would be very different. So there has been progress, but we still have these legacies and these ongoing systems that are really inequitable and that create barriers for people. And we also have the legacy of those systems that prevented certain groups and certain communities from generating wealth. And one of the best indicators of whether or not someone is going to experience poverty in their life is whether their parents or grandparents were experiencing poverty as well. So that generational transfer of wealth is really big. And in terms of representation in the labor force, representation politically, all these historical factors have really combined to create these gaps in representation, create a lot of inequities in terms of who holds the balance of wealth and power in our society. And then, more recently, so, whether you want to call this a historic or contemporary factor, depending on maybe what feels historic to you or what feels contemporary to you. We had 30 years of federal divestment from housing. We have income supports and wages that haven't kept pace with the cost of living over decades. We've seen sustained cuts to education and healthcare. We've seen a weakening of our tax system and our regulatory controls so that our tax system used to generate a lot more revenue from corporations and wealthy individuals than it does now. So we're seeing both divestment and also a loss of revenue. And we saw that for, again, a good 30 years before. We did see a sort of renewed engagement by the federal government when they released the Canadian Poverty Reduction Strategy. And the federal government said, "Oh yeah, I guess we are somewhat responsible for poverty in Canada. It's not just the provinces." And so we've seen a renewed engagement in housing. We've seen some good advancements in terms of securing the beginnings of a pharmacare program and dental care and things like that. But at the same time, we are still seeing what I was referring to before as these sort of accelerators of this affordability crisis, where we're really seeing across sectors an increase in privatization, and I've heard it coined as profitization. So we are seeing housing being treated more as a commodity, more as a way to invest your capital and increase profits for shareholders, rather than seeing housing primarily as a place to live. And so that's what we mean when you hear about the financialization of housing. So with that, we're seeing also an increase in for-profit actors that are, buying up the housing stock with the purpose of increasing their profits. And so we're seeing skyrocketing rents at the same time that provinces don't have rent controls or are removing rent controls. So those protections that used to be in place for tenants have really been rolled back. And similarly, in our healthcare system, in our food systems, we're seeing this move towards privatization, where the public sector is being chronically underfunded, and so it's starting to kind of implode. And then people are holding up the private sector as the savior that's going to come in and solve all of our wait times and solve all of our problems, because the free market has never failed to make things more equitable and affordable for people, right? So so we are seeing this increase in privatization and profitization that is really leading to a lot of profiteering and contributing grossly to the rising costs of living.
So let me ask you this: what do we lose socially when we move towards more and more privatization? Because there is that sense of market efficiency and that whole neoliberal narrative. But what do we lose as a citizenry?
Well, we pay more for it, for one thing. So even there's that diversion of resources to programs that ought to be accessible to all people, regardless of their income. And so there are all kinds of health and social impacts by that. And anytime that you see this sort of scarcity mindset come into a society where people are really struggling to afford what they need, where people are feeling that squeeze, it lends itself to a lot more scapegoating. It lends itself to a lot more polarization And so all these factors are happening at the same time as these like broader socio-political changes too, where we we don't seem to have a shared body of facts anymore. There's a real lack of trust in public institutions and governments, and so it's hard to have like a real substantive conversation about policy when that just gets co-opted by hyper-polarized or hyper-partisan rhetoric, where false solutions are overly simplistic solutions are being put forward rather than dealing with the systems as they are, or rather than really basing our responses in what people living in poverty are experiencing day to day.
So let's talk about those systems. We know that systems, I don't know, I could say that it's the goal of a system to maintain the status quo, but it's certainly an effect of a system to maintain things the way they are. Your report takes aim at the system and really dives into the systemic changes that need to be made, the systemic nature of the poverty crisis. I wondered if we could talk about why it's so important to take that deep dive to the systemic level.
So I think, first of all, again, it's really critical that we recognize poverty as a violation of people's inherent dignity and their rights. It's also a violation of treaty rights and various human rights conventions that Canada has signed on to. But so there's sort of this human rights argument, there's a moral argument. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it really shifts the way that we view people who are experiencing poverty and the way that we feel compelled to respond to what people are experiencing. So if we don't take that systemic view, then we really end up individualizing the responsibility, the blame. And so all the onus gets put on the individual to somehow work themselves out of poverty, without recognizing the systemic barriers that they're facing, without providing them with the necessary supports, and without recognizing that these are generational issues. Again, that a child who experiences poverty early in life is far more likely to experience this as an adult. So if we don't look at these systemic issues, then we just end up blaming people who are experiencing poverty. And many times we end up criminalizing their their responses to poverty. And we end up with ineffective solutions that, are actually more geared towards the middle class and upper classes than actually helping people who really need it, and whose right to an adequate standard of living is being denied. So the ways that we're responding to poverty right now are both really ineffective and inequitable, but they're also really expensive. So we actually spend a lot of money responding to poverty, and we spend that in our healthcare systems. We spend that in the criminal justice system. There's many economic arguments about the loss of tax revenue, even, and the loss of participation in the labor economy. So there's all these sort of economic interests in addition to the sort of moral and human rights arguments. So again, we're spending a lot of money ineffectively. It's actually cheaper to provide someone with housing, for example, than it is to, cover the downstream healthcare or criminal justice costs that are incurred by homelessness. So we're spending more money for poorer results. We have, even we can see this in housing, we can see this in healthcare, we can see this in criminal justice, and I think that I won't go into all the different policy examples unless people want to ask questions later. But I think it's also really important to look at the systemic nature of poverty, because poverty is not inevitable. And the poverty and the inequity that we see today is the result of policy choices that have been made, and we can choose better. So when we look at the systemic causes, we can see, why people are struggling, what are the barriers that people are facing, and we can make better choices. We have evidence and expertise in policies and programs that have been demonstrated to work effectively. Most of them need to be expanded and made more adequate, but we don't have poverty in Canada because we don't know what to do about it. We don't have poverty in Canada because we don't have the resources to deal with it. We have poverty in Canada because we've made certain policy choices and we're not exercising the public and political will required to make the changes that are necessary to do what we know would actually work.
Well, that's powerful. I think we have our soundbite and maybe a subtitle for our episode saying poverty is not inevitable. Um, you in the report, you have a number of different policy choices. I'm going to call them levers that you're recommending. And we don't have time to get into all of them now. But do you have a couple that during this time, as we approach federal election, as you look out at the windows of opportunity that exist politically and economically, socially, two that we might be able to, well, not to guarantee, it's not a race or anything like that. I'm not going to put money on it, but that you'd be willing to kind of advocate for. They're all important, but let's choose two.
Yeah, this is tough, but I think particularly given the current moment and some of the ridiculous and harmful comments that have been made south of the border, there is this kind of nice epiphenomenon to that where Canadians are reminded how much they like their public health care. And so while this is, largely a provincial jurisdiction, the federal government has been playing an important role in recent years in expanding Medicare in Canada and also introducing pharmacare. And we did see some gains in this recently. And there's there's such a great body of evidence for the downstream savings and the social and economic and of course health benefits of investing in preventative care and investing in access to primary care, and that includes mental health care, I should say. But so I think expanding access to Medicare and expanding the provision of publicly funded, publicly delivered, and that's really going to be the key, because if it shifts to a private healthcare model, then the evidence tells us we can expect worse outcomes and we can expect to pay more for those worse outcomes. So publicly delivered, publicly funded and universally accessible healthcare and pharmacare, I would say is one big piece that we know there's broad public support, and that's only been heightened recently, given the suggestion that we might want to become the 51st state and adopt an American healthcare model. The second area that I would say I think there is momentum for, just because so many people are talking about it, is affordable housing. And I will say that with the caveat that, a lot of people are talking about housing and what we really specifically need to talk about is affordable non-market rental housing, because that's where the need is greatest. And that's where we really have an opportunity to address this financialization. So I think pushing for Canada to increase the proportion of the rental housing market that is affordable non-market housing. So right now that percentage is at about 3.5% of the rental market. And there are many calls to increase that to 7%, which would be consistent with the OECD average. So given the amount of public attention on housing and every party, saying that they're going to solve the housing crisis, those are the healthcare and housing, I'd say, are two areas where I think there's broad public support and there's some good momentum.
And some windows of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. So in a final real question, and this has been a fascinating conversation for me. I've read the report a couple of times, but to talk to you about it and to see the passion and hear the passion in your voice is really special. But we're all sitting on pins and needles, waiting for the writ to drop. And we know that it's coming. We know that there will be a federal election. How can we mobilize public action at this particular time? What are some of the things that we should be talking about together? What are some of the things that we should be talking to our MPs about, to people that knock on our door? What are your suggestions for public engagement during this very, very important time?
Well, one of the things I like to share with people is that you don't need to be a policy expert to tell your candidates or your MP what you care about. And so I think letting them know that you are engaged, that you're watching, that you are expecting them to do better is a starting point. And CPJ is going to be releasing our election bulletin very soon. I would say by the end of next week. And so I would recommend that people check out that resource, and I'll share the link in the chat for where that's going to be posted, along with some other pre-election events that we're planning. But that resource will provide you with a bit of a snapshot of where we are on poverty in Canada, climate justice, and refugee and migrant rights, which are our three main issues. And there will be suggested questions that you can ask candidates and tips for evaluating their responses. So I think, asking good questions of candidates, but also of others in your community. And we've all been in those conversations where someone makes some offhand remark and you're like, there's some scapegoating or there's some misinformation there. So I think speaking up, it's not always the easiest, but I think, again, there's a way to do it in gentleness, and we're turning to the evidence, and we're turning to what people's day-to-day experiences are. And I would also just say, like, don't discount the power of your faithful witness over time. I know that in my own life, I have changed my ideas and attitudes on some pretty big issues. But it took like 16 years in some cases, and I look at the people who were faithfully demonstrating to me throughout that time that there was another viable option, that there was another way of thinking about this, there was another way of living faithfully into this conviction. And so we can be that faithful witness for people. We can show, actually, when we trust people, actually when we treat people with dignity and respect, actually when we treat people as rights holders, here are the outcomes that we see of that. And so I think as individuals, as community groups, as congregations, as churches, we can have these like pilot projects even that we engage in that both speak volumes to the people in our lives and in our communities, but they also speak to elected officials, they speak to governments, because they show you're invested, they show you're engaged, and they show you're paying attention and you're watching. And so I think, being part of different advocacy movements is one way to do that as well. Having your name counted among CPJ members, or showing up at rallies and showing up at events. These are all different ways that we can demonstrate our engagement and solidarity. And I would just encourage people. I really, really love this model of the social change ecosystem map by Deepa Iyer that's shared in the Poverty Trends report. And it looks at these different roles that people change in social change movements, because we're not all policy analysts, thanks be to God. We're not all people who are going to feel comfortable yelling in the streets, but maybe you're a caregiver who is making it possible for someone to go out and do that work. Maybe you are a frontline responder. Maybe you are a great storyteller. So there's all these different roles that we can play to be part of this movement for change. And I think, again, this is something that our spiritual formation has trained us for, that we know we're called to use the unique gifts and situations in which God has placed us to work together to see that kingdom of God come to earth.
Well, Natalie, thank you for bringing your unique gifts to this space tonight. Thank you for your passion and your inspiration and your insight. Very much appreciated. And I'm going to turn it back over to Trevor and to Stan.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Stephen, for a very stimulating discussion. Certainly give us something to think about and to ponder, prayerfully ponder, since over 30 minutes ago. And I just want, before we go break into small group conversations to reflect on some questions that we have offered, is there any initial questions for Natalie before we do that? And we'll come back to a plenary to conclude our evening together, but it's just, there's some initial questions that any of you would have. And just put up your digital hand if you can find it. Joe.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, Natalie. Natalie, maybe you didn't mention that Natalie's not only a mom, but she was a teacher. And in the report, I know there was a lot of comment about food insecurity. Some more than a quarter of households or people in Canada find food insecurity as a problem. It's especially bad in the north. One of the things we've heard a little bit about recently from the government, and I don't know if it will continue, is the business of school food programs, lunch programs, or breakfast programs for kids. And we have an issue of intergenerational poverty that in this country where some of us at a certain age are, I mean, we're cared for, and child poverty, we did get the child benefit, the Canada Child Benefit through. But what do you think about those kinds of steps, Natalie? Is this a good idea? Would it really help from your own experience?
I think school food programs are a great idea, but I don't think that they are necessarily best understood as a poverty reduction strategy. So certainly they do help provide kids with healthy, nutritious, and in the best case scenario, culturally appropriate food in schools. And so absolutely that, that is going to have positive impacts on their development, on their learning and educational outcomes. It can reduce some of the strain on families in terms of not having to pay for those lunches and snacks. But a lot of the benefits of school food programs are actually environmental benefits. There are labor benefits, particularly when they're designed to prioritize local procurement and sustainable food systems. So we do support CPJ is a member of the Coalition for Healthy School Food, and we do support those programs. I think it's important that they not be oversold as a solution to food insecurity, because the solution to food insecurity is to increase income for people in poverty, so that they can afford the food that they need. And obviously there's all kinds of other levers, like if you reduce the cost of housing, if you provide pharmacare, then they have more income to do that. So school food programs are great. I don't think they should be seen necessarily as a solution to food insecurity, but there are many connected benefits of those programs.
Thank you, Joe. Rita.
Yeah, thanks very much, Natalie, for a great connection, making the connection between our faith and human rights, and just the political part of the argument, as we're advocating with politicians, with maybe we might even be volunteering and knocking on the doors in campaigns. The other end of the spectrum politically has had these slogans, like axe the tax and all those simplistic slogans that apparently people buy into. because it's simple, gives a simplistic solution. Are there any slogans that we could use that would have a similar appeal? Look, I've heard from some groups that tax the rich, is one slogan that would work. But any other suggestions you might have, or is that something that maybe we could come up with as a group? I don't know.
So I'm going to admit that like succinct slogans are not my forte, as you may have guessed from my ramble this evening. But I can share that recently I was at an SOS Medicare conference that was being put on by the Canadian Health Coalition, and the Canadian Labour Congress was sharing some polling results, and they were saying, there's like tax the rich doesn't land as well actually with most people, but those same people are much more favorable towards like taxing corporate greed. So talking about, again, when you're focusing on this, like the profiteering, the corporate greed, that's really resonating with people. I think people also are fed up with this sense of like too much bureaucracy. So that's why things like Axe the Tax or like cutting red tape, I think those are still appealing slogans. So I think, again, it's finding ways to move beyond the slogans. Like I understand sometimes we fight fire with fire, but I think we also really need to just like lean into our niche, which is and I think particularly faith communities have this particular niche where we can connect with people who probably have, are a good diversity of political leanings. And we can focus on the shared values that we have, and we can ask, I think asking good questions is one of the best ways to go about it. And because I think, if you ask people like what is the outcome that you think government should be working towards? Like, what do you think governments are here to do? What's their job? And I think if you get people thinking about like that bigger picture, like is the government's job really to increase GDP or like help private profit grow? Like, I don't think too many people, even if they're, of a particular political disposition, I don't think too many people would say like, yeah, that's what government's here for. So like the idea of like a social contract, I think the idea of, creating a future where all people can flourish, all people and all creation can flourish. That's some of the language that CPJ uses. I think it's appealing to that kind of language and that kind of bigger picture idea that kind of gets us out of, I can't afford this. Why are we helping these people when we're struggling with this? Like let's ask those bigger questions and get to, what are we working towards? Because again, I think so often our those simplistic policy responses have such a short-sighted lack of ambition. So not great with slogans, but hopefully there's some framing that that resonates with people.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita, for the question. And Natalie for your response. I have a question, and I'm just trying to articulate it, but it revolves around the policy of guaranteed livable income and its role in helping reduce poverty, affordability, the cost of living. And a lot of people know about guaranteed livable income throughout the world. And I guess my question is, why hasn't it really caught on, at least in Canada? It was a pilot project in Ontario a number of years ago, and when the Ford government came in, they canceled it. And we had a webinar at the Jesuit Forum on speaking with someone who was part of that pilot project and the consequences of its cancellation on her and others she knew. why is it so hard to get off the ground? Because it's too complicated, or yeah, do you have any insight into that as a policy and the struggles that around it for it getting accepted?
Yeah, I think without wanting this to sound too crass, but like I think fundamentally a lot of people just don't trust people in poverty. They don't trust people in poverty with money. So I think like that's one barrier. It's just like the many prejudices and biases that our society still has against people in poverty. So that's one piece. The other piece is I think just like the upfront cost of it is a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, and there's a lot of complexity in figuring out like what would be the ideal design for a guaranteed livable income or a basic income. So the Parliamentary Budget Officer just released a report recently that showed actually that with this within these parameters of a basic income program, we could reduce poverty by this. I think it was 40% or something like that. But it showed like the huge difference in outcomes depending on like the simple distinction between whether you were evaluating like a household income as like an economic, like the economic definition of a household versus a nuclear household. And just like that minor policy distinction made a huge difference in the cost. It made a huge difference in the outcomes and which quintile of the of the income distribution benefited. So it is a complex decision to be made about how such a system should be designed. Should it be designed as a supplement to existing income programs? Should it replace those income programs? So I think just that like upfront price ticket is pretty hard for a lot of governments to sign on for. But this is one of those things where again we have huge amounts of evidence that shows that basic income would reduce poverty really effectively. It would reduce inequities. It would improve health outcomes. It does not prevent people from joining the labor force. We would have all kinds of downstream savings from a basic income. And these are all things that were shown in that PBO report. Even, if you want to quibble over the design specifics. But I think it's that upfront cost and just the sustained biases against people in poverty that are really blocking the way, because we've let things get so bad, the amount that we need to invest to make them right is big. So even though we have evidence that there would be payoff, and whether that's with increasing income assistance, having a basic income, increasing affordable housing, like Finland, for example, where they ended chronic homelessness, that took a huge national investment. And so that upfront cost, governments need to be convinced that the public support will sustain them if they make that decision. So if they think they make that decision and it's going to cost them an election, they're not going to do it. So we really need to show that the public support is there and that the public demand is there for those investments, and again paired also with other policies to generate the revenue that's needed, like a wealth tax and increasing corporate tax rates.
Good, thank you. Maybe we'll take a question from Ellen, and then we'll move into small groups. Ellen.
Yeah, thanks. Natalie, that was a great presentation and some good answers to some questions I had myself. Just to follow up with the last question on basic income or guaranteed livable income, do you think there might be any greater appetite for it in the light of, like we know that we're in the midst of a tariff war? Some people are going to lose their jobs because of the shenanigans that's happening with the tariffs and the trade war and so on, do you think there'd be any greater appetite for some kind of income support that protects people from the cost of this trade war, and that's kind of a way that we could garner support for basic income?
I think you're right, Elin. I think, and nice to see you again. I think, again, in terms of people who are advocating for policy, like effective policy responses, and who are engaging it from like a substantive evidence-based perspective, I think yes, there's an opportunity there. Unfortunately, the reason that I didn't, when Stephen made me pick two policies where I felt that there was a window of opportunity, I didn't pick basic income because there's so much rhetoric of austerity right now, and there's so much fear about economic uncertainty as a nation. And unfortunately, that economic insecurity for the nation and for businesses is overshadowing our concern for the economic insecurity of individual people living in poverty. And so I don't expect that we're going to see a great window of opportunity right at this moment. But that being said, you know, I think we are seeing progress. I think it, in terms of like building broader political support, building broader societal support for basic income. So I do think that societal support is growing. I just don't think it's reached the tipping point that's going to be required to counter the kinds of concerns about austerity and you know, Canadian sovereignty that are really occupying everyone's attention these days. But I hate to be an naysayer, so we could prove me wrong.
Thank you, Natalie. So we'll have another opportunity to come back at the other end of our sharing circles. But we're going to move into sharing circles now. And it's 7:35. So the idea is that we will break up into small groups, and Stan will lead us into that, and probably 2 or 3 groups, given our numbers. And we'll come back at, I believe, so just to get the overall.
Should we give ourselves an hour still, or a bit less?
Well, you have
because we have 3 questions.
8:25. So
okay, so 50 minutes. Very good. 50 minutes, and we'll have 3 groups. And I'm going to send it. Do you want to give a very quick introduction about the fact that it's confidential? We won't be recording what's happening in the groups, and people can choose to share. Or
yes. So they're based on the 3 questions that I believe everyone would have received with the registration material. First question is, what struck you most in the Poverty Trends Report, or the presentation, or from the discussion between Natalie and Stephen? So what resonated with you? 1 or 2 things. And then the second question is, what has informed the way you think about and respond to poverty in Canada, such as theology, scripture, lived experience, your own experience of poverty, or those you know? Anything in the culture that influences your way of how you look upon and respond to poverty. And then the third question, how do you see your political action being of help in addressing the issue of affordability and poverty in Canada? So that may be a little more involved, but so and each group will have a facilitator, so to kind of manage time well. And just imagine you're in an actual physical small group, and it's a structured conversation. So it's not a back and forth so much, although there may be time for that after, but it's a round of sharing. So imagine the speaker is holding a talking stick or a sacred feather, and that person has 2 or 3 minutes to share on the question. And then when they're finished, a moment of silence, and then it moves on to the next person. So there's really no interruption. It's allowing each other to speak. And while each person is speaking, that we are deeply listening. We're genuinely listening, not just listening, waiting for our turn, but genuinely listening. Because we find these types of sharing circles important because it calls us to articulate how it is we're feeling in a safe space upon the issues of our time. So with that,
Okay, I'm going.